Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Arena STL. I'm Will Freeman, and welcome to another edition here. Provided now, the completely merged, now to Fuse Sports Network, Gateway City Sports has merged to Fuse Sports Network, and here we are. Week 4 of Arena Football League has been done. Things have been changing. There were some goods. There was a little bit of lows. And then we will also talk about the newest thing in Arena Football, and that is the new Arena League, which is kind of small at first, but has a lot of interesting concept if you saw last week's video. First things I think we should discuss first before going into Week 4 of the Arena Football League is right after the day after our show, they finally had a conference call, or interview, if you will, with now the new intern commissioner of the Arena Football League, Jeff Fisher, and also with G1 Sports, Chris Chetty, the ones who own the trademarks and the licensing of the Arena Football League properties. Yeah, you guys don't know that, first things first here, as I have here, the Arena Football League has returned to thearenafootballleague.com. Originally, it was Arena Football USA when Lee Hutton was commissioner. Now, after that whole debacle, they have now switched everything back to thearenafootballleague.com, which actually is better organized, and it's updated with teams that are both active and inactive, schedules, scores, and also links to live for when the games start. Though it looks, as of right now, they're still in a mixture of Viring Network and also with YouTube for some of the games that happened here on Week 4. Now, let me fix that. Now, as I was saying on with the conference call, Chris Chetty put something out that was kind of interesting. He said that when they were trying to get an agreement done, and they were trying to get this signed agreement done for 15 months, they said that they were just letting Lee Hutton, Trevor Gaines, and everyone in Arena Football League, just leave it up to them, and they just look around, go in the back, or let them handle it. This kind of reminds me of, if anyone remembers, this is one of my favorite movies, The Founder. And of course, we're going to go with McDonald's, if you franchisor, franchisee. You sign an agreement to take over certain licensing and represent the brand. But you also have to hold to rules of that brand in order to keep it. This situation, they probably thought, Lee Hutton, giving all this stuff, because mostly from past interviews from people that interviewed him and other artists, Lee Hutton was a great storyteller. A very great storyteller, and I guess the best way, because here's the thing. Con Man, for what stands for Con, was known as called Confident, shortened to Con. And he probably had those similar traits of showing a lot of confidence, and that's how a lot of people believe you nowadays. That's how it usually goes in the con game. And they now took over back their property because, as I said last week, they never signed the deal. Well, actually, no, they signed the deal, but they never paid for it. So they were able to be like, well, kick you out. We'll take it back now, because this is our trademarks and we need to protect our branding. And when I went back to The Founder, if you guys have seen that movie, great movie starring Michael Keaton, there was an incident where one of the people, and that's the letter right there for G6 Sports explaining the whole thing, getting the property back, that when he realized one of the franchisees were not going, because they were serving fried chicken, which was not part of the deal, he actually went up to the owner and said, "What is this?" And gave some BS type of reasoning, and basically that agreement and store for McDonald's was basically closed and got rid because they violated the agreement. And another good thing about this, when Jeff Fisher was in that press conference, he basically said that we want to make sure we get back to being truthful and transparent, which was very important, because with Lee Hutton, they did not have it at all for the first 3 weeks. And we'll just have to see if it starts a little bit better or goes a little bit down a little bit, because there were some positive, there were some slight negatives, but it just has to go because we just have to see if they start getting out of the fire or they keep on going and rise back up. Because I want this to succeed, and a lot of people want the Arena Football League branding back to what it was a few years ago before they ended for the second time back in 2019. So let's start with the first game, of course, and that was with the Atlanta Predators at the West Texas Desert Hawks. That game was Thursday night, and it was on the Vari Network. The streaming was a little spotty at times, and I was wondering if it's just my connection. But then I contacted a few people that were watching, said no, it was the same thing. But then apparently it looks like West Texas or Odessa, that's where it's located, had a bit of some storming problems, so that kind of ruined the streaming part of it. And that was a great game to start with this. I guess we'll call it the 3.5 era of Arena Football League for what has been going on the last few weeks. Like I said, Arena Football, both fascinating and frustrating at the same time. And it was like very close. This had everything because if I had a bingo card, I would probably click space of interception, player ejection, and all sorts of stuff. But what was very interesting about this game was early on, a lot of rouges, and people that don't know the term, a rouge is basically not letting the receiver of the receiving team get the ball past the end zone. So basically kind of like a touchback. And if the opposing team were able to keep the other player receiving the ball in the end zone area, they get 1 point. And there were a lot of them. And like I said, this game was back and forth and close to the end, and the Orlando Predators get their victory over them 50-39. Second one was the IC Regulators at the Nashville Cats. Nashville Cats finally get their first victory of the season. Very talented team, but this is only their first victory, 58-26, in kind of a neutral site game, technically. It was in Nashville, but not at their home because of scheduling conflicts. But win's a win in that way. And then another thing I have to mention, because last week it was announced 10 teams, but through their announcement, kind of like negotiating franchise stuff, the Oregon Black Bears were able to come back in the league, but more as a travel team, but not have a home base, because if you guys watched in Salem, Oregon, they were playing and basically were holding rodeos and all sorts of cattle events. And their dashboards was basically cattle fencing covered up with a little bit of plastic paper, basically. So they're mostly just a travel team for the Arena Football League here for the 2024 season, and probably looking to get a proper venue so they could play in the 2025 season if that happens. Being positive, but I have to say if at this point. And that was always a defensive game at first and close to the end, facing the Washington Wolfpack in Oregon, who, even though they're traveling, they are 3-0 now, beating them 27-25 against the Wolfpack. Then the other next game, and there's a little controversy. Let me go through that after this here. The Liberty versus the Outlaws, and Outlaws being 54-35. Another close game, very competitive through. The biggest problem was, and I noticed this and a few others, that as everyone knows in the Arena Football League, they were bringing back the Ironman rules, and I noticed a lot more substitutions. I was like, wait a minute, because with the rule book, and let me be clear, this was the Lee Hutton rule book, and it looks like they got it okay from the league to just be a little bit more lean on the substitution rules. So in the original rule book, well, this rule book, you only could substitute like 1 to 2 times each quarter. Now was just a little bit more, so players didn't get much tired. So maybe they're trying to, but I hope they still stay to the Ironman roots, because that was the staple for the Arena Football League. Then came probably the least competitive game out of all of them, and that was the Kansas Storm versus the Albany Firebirds. Yeah, that one, 66-15. Not very good at all on that one. So Albany continues to be one of the top teams in the Football League and continues on. Kansas City Storm, they had some good things last week, but not this week. Though one thing that happened, like we did before a few weeks ago, AFL to NFL, there's actually was an AFL to UFL signing with running back Jeremy Cox now going to the Arlington Renegades. So good for them. Good for him. And hold on here, trying to get my notes here. Then just wanted to get to another thing too. There was supposed to be another game with the Rapid City Marshals, but they decided to go with a bye and had a little bit of problem because during the week, 10 players left. 10 players. So this is the more bad part, as I said, because they were taking 3 steps forward and now have 2 steps back because of this. Rapid City Marshals didn't play, had a bye. They played next week. But it's kind of interesting that they keep losing this, and this was still due to the CIF deal that the AFL had when they merged. The AFL was supposed to provide with player salaries, room and board, and also travel. I still think they're doing that now with the new one, but they're still suffering from that and trying to get the financing for that. Though, interesting enough, Rapid City, because believe it or not, since yesterday on May 20th, this is now 2 years they have not had a win. Let me say that again. 2 years. And they have not had a victory in their franchise since. 2. Man. And one thing of... Yes, Derek.
I'm just popping in. Popping in because I had to be a part of the show.
Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of obviously add a little bit of levity because, I'm wild and crazy, as everybody knows. But, we're talking about this AFL stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously we've been through the original, Arena League, right? From way back in the day. We've been through XFL 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. We've been through the UFL stuff. We've been through the AAF stuff. We've been through all these different. What is it specifically that you could explain to the viewer that differentiates the AFL product between something that's more akin to NFL type product, which is like the UFL? How can you dictate to the viewer the differences between those two leagues if they're not necessarily accustomed to that product?
Yeah, because both of them, because Arena is 8-man football, of course, and UFL, of course, is 11-man as the regular. There's some similarities, but we have to remember that players in the Arena game have made it to the NFL before. Kurt Warner's the biggest example, of course, when he was with the Iowa Bronze Stars, then came to the Rams and all. We already know that story, American Underdog Hall of Fame career, yada, yada, yada. It's a bit different, but it just depends on the skill set, because Arena football players, there's usually a little bit more speed with like wide receivers, of course, some smaller size, some big size. It just depends, because there's some talent that you look for what's in the UFL currently, and there's some skill set that people are looking for in Arena football. And it's different, but interesting enough. But somehow, in both ways, you can end up in the NFL either way. It just depends on your guys' skill set. Though I will say, when it comes to it's still kind of the same either way for linemen, except for the restrictions when it comes to defensive linemen, because you can't do stunts, you can't do this or that, and then don't forget the restrictions with the linebackers can either go back or blitz or go side to side.
Right, and the speed of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not forget that, how explosive this game is. We showed the scores just earlier in one of the formats, and those scores, you really have to look at that and go, wow, that's a lot of points, because the point system is similar in a lot of instances. Obviously, with the UFL, they have their 2-yard line, 5-yard line, 10-yard line as far as their 1, 2, and 5 and 3-point conversions. They do not do kicks in the UFL. Now, with this iteration of the Arena Football League, the AFL, and everything that we're talking about specifically around that and the cadence and speed, and specifically how the field is broke down in versus how you have 100 yards in traditional football and where you're having more condensed fields in certain arena leagues. In certain formats, you'll have less yardage. And so, again, it just speeds up. But in these instances, with the two-way stuff, the rule set, a lot of different things, and this is what you kind of iterated on, was with Kurt Warner. And I know that you can touch a little bit more on that, and I want you to, because for people who aren't familiar with that era, when Kurt was in the Arena Football League, when he was with the Iowa Barnstormers, explain to the fans out there what they would have seen and what made Kurt into the player that he eventually became.
Yeah, I can explain it, because when it comes, like you said, speed was a big thing. It's not just speed like run speed either. It's like game speed as well, reaction time. And one thing that caused Kurt Warner to become so great for playing arena football is reaction time. Like, see a blitz coming real quick, be able to throw a ball real quickly to the openest wide receiver he can. And that was the one thing, be able to see the hot routes quicker. Because arena football, the NFL speed game is like, you can kind of see like he was actually faster at times, getting the reaction for him to get the balls to, Isaac, Torrey, Ozaki, Marshall, Ernie Conwell, and all of them. That was the biggest thing, his reaction time. And also, it also helped that he did have Orlando Place blocking his blind side, either or for speed.
I mean, if you could have that guy blocking your blind side any day of the week, man, you got to take that. I mean, one of the greatest left tackles, probably right up there in the history of the game. One of the greatest offensive linemen, really, frankly, in the history of the game, right up there with like Anthony Munoz, Bruce Matthews. Gosh, I mean, there's so many that come to mind. Dan Deerdorf, obviously, in St. Louis. There's a lot of people that go, Conrad Dobler. Conrad Dobler operated in such a great area as a football player. I mean, he gouged guys in the eyes. He'd hook them by the mouth. He'd punch them. He'd elbow them. He'd in the ribs. He'd stomp them in the nether regions. I mean, he did a lot of really nasty stuff whenever he was playing, and that's why he was voted SI's dirtiest player of all time. And they did that whole interview package, and he was in a jail cell, and he really played that moniker up as a player. But that was kind of his smash mouth way. Going back to Kurt, you explained something really, really well, in that the fast-paced nature of arena ball and that styling, having in that instance, I believe at that time they didn't have sidelines. Is that correct? They didn't even have sidelines. They just had the barrier boards, and that's all they had.
Yeah, the dasher boards, because you have to remember most of them were in hockey arenas. So
Right, exactly. And so, you're doing it in this condensed, field. And were they running 50 yards at the time? 25 and 25 in a 50 split?
Something like that. It depends on, because some have to be changed and some didn't, depending on the arenas.
Depending on the arena at the time.
Because
it's so fast paced.
Because it wasn't just like, for example, when the Stampede were here, they were playing at a NHL, the highest in hockey in U.S., though, like the Iowa Barnstormers, that was mostly the minor league arenas, which could be exact like the NHL arenas or a little bit tweaks, because not the same amount of seats in the building and stuff like the AHL. And there's a lot more minor leagues and stuff there. I don't want to get into that, because that's a little bit more of a world that goes like this
way too deep. But you're also talking a very important core component to these skill sets, these transitions of these players to be able to go from one organization or one league and be able to jump across the board to another league and have success. Let's not forget, Kurt Warner did play in the NFL in 1994. I believe it was 1994. He was with the Green Bay Packers.
Yeah.
That's whenever they had, I believe, Kurt, they had Favre, they had Detmer, I think at the time, Ty Detmer. And I don't remember if Jim McMahon was over there at the time. I think he was in Minnesota that time in 94. But
I'm
I
not
know
too
that Jim
sure about
McMahon
that.
did play the year that they won the Super Bowl in, what was that, 96? I believe is what it was, with the Green Bay Packers won the Super Bowl, if I'm not mistaken, with Brett Favre. And I believe McMahon was on the roster, Jim McMahon, the former Bears great quarterback at the time. But again, playing in that scheme, playing in that format and having to learn boom, boom, boom. You literally have 1, 2, 3. That's it. Those guys are on top of you at that point. You don't have a chance to even breathe, let alone think. And that's
Mark
where
Burnett.
we had that success in St. Louis.
Yeah, and of course, like we said earlier, didn't hurt to have Orlando Place, which I think he's the only
Mark Brunell, Scott, my man.
Yeah.
Scott pulled it out. It was Mark Brunell that was in that quarterback room at that time. What a class.
Yeah.
I mean, wow.
94 was a very good draft class, and like I was saying for Orlando Pace, I think he's so far the only offensive lineman that was closely considered for the Heisman during college, because he did all sorts of like Heisman nominee stuff. Like I remember the stuff for like the Orlando Pace Pancake House. He was doing all the with all the pancake blocks and all that stuff, and like him, he's the only offensive lineman kind of similar to Ndamukong Suh as the closest defensive lineman for the Heisman. So,
well, and the thing is with these players that come out of these developmental leagues, right? So Kurt played in the Arena League. He also played in NFL Europe.
Yep.
Now, again, that time frame, if anybody watched NFL Europe, I watched NFL Europe. I watched every game that I could watch NFL Europe wise. I know you did too, Will. And to watch that product, again, NFL based rules, NFL everything, how they made that work still to this day surprises me. But again, it was treated, like we said before, like a spring league. And when they were playing over there, guys got to play over there that just weren't going to get the chance over here. And they could be able to get that time and develop that rhythm, whether they were a backup, whether they were, right on the cusp of being a starter, but they just needed a little bit more playing time to hone and sharpen their skills. It's unfortunate that we don't have more of that stuff. And yes, the UFL has come in. Yes, we still have the Arena Leagues. Yes, we still have the CFL. There are places to go. But again, to have that platform to play with that level, that caliber of player, instead of, well, this guy was a second line, guy in college, or this was a guy that may be a bench guy in the CFL. I mean, don't get me wrong. The CFL is a very, very high caliber, very high quality product, and with very high caliber players that can play at an extraordinarily good level. I mean, no further to look than Doug Flutie and Warren Moon, who both came back from the CFL after winning multiple Grey Cups. Both came over, both had success. So there's no disputing that CFL players that are starting and having great success can come over to the NFL and still have success. Now, will they have success to the level of what they had in the CFL in Canada? The likelihood of that is not high, but I mean, Warren Moon, my man, and you can't see it back behind me because I got it tucked behind my McGuire jersey. I've got a Warren Moon signed jersey. I'm a big Warren Moon fan. So, that's kind of my thing. But again, it stresses the importance of these leagues, and that, you need to watch and you need to pay attention, because if you aren't watching and you're not paying attention, then you're missing something.
Yeah, and also the CFL, they kind of do have one thing that was kind of similar with Arena, and that's, of course, the wide receiver able to move up to the line script right before. Of course, CFL is a little bit different than NFL because they have one extra player, both offense and defense, and, of course, 3 downs, and not to mention a big, big field. Though I still wish they didn't put the field goal posts in between the end zones like the NFL had back in, I think they changed it like 60, 70, somewhere in there, because sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes. And, it's here's my thing with some of these leagues. And this is what I've personally experienced. It's been this nature of constant shuffle. And the fans that are out there watching right now can attest to this. With the on again, off again, on again, off again, starting and stopping of all of these leagues, not just the XFL, not just, the USFL. The original USFL ran from, what was it, 84 to 87, something like that?
3 years, yeah.
3 years. So they had a 3-year span, and they were trying to compete. They were bringing it. They had Herschel Walker. They had Steve Young. They had some pretty decent players that they could, rely on, that were, eventually ended up being extraordinarily good NFL talents. And so it wasn't like they were just, I think even Reggie White played over.
Yeah, he did
a little bit, didn't he? And
so Reggie White and
the Minister of Defense. How could you shake a stick at that?
And then I can't remember the name, but like a few years ago, the Denver Broncos player got into the Hall of Fame, and he was in the original USFL as well. So they do have quite a few Hall of Famers that came from that league. Of course, everyone knows how that happened. They moved all the way to the fall, and then we got that thing with the Buck deal, a book that I have, and I recommend reading it. Of course, now that you see with all the potential ownership this year, you have celebrities, because back then in the original USFL, Burt Reynolds was the owner of the Tampa Bay Bandits, and he was like the main celebrity. Actually had a sports franchise to his name, which was not really common back then. Now that's actually getting more common now in all sorts of sports, especially with the whole thing with Ryan Reynolds and that soccer club in Europe right now, Wrexham, I think.
Exactly. And that goes to show you what a little bit of star power and a little bit of pizzazz, a little bit of excitement will do for your product, and Jones up the base. It'll really get them going. It'll really get them ramped up and excited. In Wrexham, the first year they were, have you seen their advertisement, as some people would say, over across the pond? But their advertisement that they had was like, well, in the first Rocky movie, he fights the champ and he loses. That's kind of what happened to us. And then in the second movie, he wins. And in the third movie, he loses. And then, it's that, but then he wins again at the end of the movie. I mean, again, I don't think I'm spoiling anybody from a movie from 1983.
No.
84, whenever I say Rocky won at the end of the movie. I don't think I'm spoiling that one by any stretch of the imagination.
No, of course. They actually filmed the season ahead, so you're actually you see the season before that happens with that show. So yeah, it's gonna interesting with types of ownership and stuff. Of course, now with these alternatives, you're getting both people that are owning it and also league ownership. Of course, with the AFL that just happened, most of the teams that were league owned were the ones that had problems. And then only just maybe about one or two had problems that were owned by somebody, which of course was the Iowa Rampage. They are inactive right now. They could come back. They may not. It's just kind of interesting what's going to happen after they salvage the 2024 season, and see if they do come back for 2025, because they, as I said, the G6 owns the licensing rights to all of the Arena Football League, and if they're able to salvage it, they're going to try to keep going with it. But like I said, for Jeff Fisher as the interim commissioner, they're probably, after the season, if they continue, they're going to probably find someone else to do it.
Well, and that's the question that I have for you, Will. For the uninitiated, what's the story behind these teams that are faltering and the teams that are going under? Is there an underlying story to that? Is there something that we're not being told, or something that we're missing perhaps in some of that, storyline?
Well, I'll start with the Oregon Black Bears, that are now, instead of having a home, they have a traveling team, because they did put out a statement, the owner did, that they had a league official that was still under Hutton that okayed what the arena situation was. So I don't know. They have yet to name who that league official is, but knowing how the stuff that happened between Hutton and Travell Gaines and that type of situation is still kind of wondering because if you watch previous episode, Travell Gaines found out with the whole thing with Louisiana Voodoo from the players that Lee Hutton was blaming Gaines for all the problems when Gaines was actually going to be a potential owner of Louisiana Voodoo and take that from the from the league ownership. And then
That sounds like a pretty convoluted series of events.
yeah, series unfortunate events if you get my drift from that
unfortunately led to the dysfunction of really, to be frankly honest, let's be fair. That's been a lot of the issues with this league at this point has been the musical chairs stuff, obviously with what you reported on earlier with Lee Hutton, the replacement of him with Jeff Fisher, your former NFL coach, former defensive backs coach in the NFL. But this is, hopefully this has settled down. Is that what we're starting to see at this point, or are we starting to see maybe something a little bit different?
I think more is settling down and getting a little bit better in some aspects because now they're trying to filter which franchises to survive and which will probably continue. Because, like I said before, Rapid City Marshals, they had 10 players leave because they were not getting paid due to that agreement with Lee Hutton at AFL because they were supposed to provide pay for players, room and board pay for that, and also for traveling. That probably got fixed, but some players probably just got fed up with it and just moved on. And that's the thing. And I don't know, because Rapid City, I like their game day presentation with the Contra stuff, though the Contra's a little bit long. They have the red turf field. They have a good game atmosphere. It's so weird to me, even for arena team, like I mentioned before. Yesterday marked the 2-year anniversary since the last victory for that franchise. They are basically the Detroit Lions of in arena football right now.
Yeah. That's, the thing is I used to love the Detroit Lions whenever I was younger because they had Barry Sanders, right? All through, into the 80s and stuff that, into the mid late 80s, they had Barry Sanders. I remember when Scott Mitchell, the quarterback for the Detroit Lions in the early 90s, was the backup for Dan Marino in Miami with the Dolphins. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe Scott Mitchell might have even had some USFL time. I could have thought, but I could be completely off base on that. I do know that he, towards the end of his career, I believe he played for the Baltimore Ravens for like 1 or 2 seasons there for a little bit, kind of like how Vinny Testaverde had played for Cleveland for years prior to that, playing with Tampa Bay, and then obviously moving on to the Jets and so on and so forth. But the Detroit Lions, going back to that, were a fun team, I felt like, at the time in the early 90s, and they had some success. I was really hoping, because Scott Mitchell had that one good year. It was in 93 or 94, whenever it was. And I believe that they had made it to the first round of the playoffs, and I think he just muffed it up and just really screwed everything up for him. But it goes to show you that teams can turn it around, even though they're abysmally bad. They could be the Cleveland Browns, Detroit Lions, St. Louis Rams for, years, and then finally end up turning it around. Don't you think? What say you?
Yeah, of course. Just turn around. I just hope we don't see something equivalent of Dan Orlowski backing up into his own end zone and causing a safety like that happened a few years ago when Calvin Johnson was his receiver. So hopefully nothing like that.
Well, things happen. It is professional sports, and we've seen some weird things, and we could go down the list of some of those weird things at another time because we could do a whole show on just anomalies that we've seen in professional football in some capacity. But kind of circling back to arena football specifically, and I can remember watching some games back in kind of like the late 90s in arena football and watching how fast paced it was. It's kind of the same thing with the CFL. I was always really shocked by the pace of the game and how speedy it was. And it always impressed me that they knew how to do stuff so fast. It's such a fast clip. That was always impressive to me because I felt like in the NFL, things had a procedure, right? It developed slowly over time. You can kind of watch it and you can kind of in your head as a football fan or as an educated football fan, you can go, oh, okay, this is what they're going to do. This is the direction they're going to kind of go with this. With that type of sport, you don't know. It's so fast. It's bang, 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 bang. That's at least that's my representation of it. And I kind of speaking, to be honest, I would feel for the general novice fan, the uninitiated to the sport, I feel like that's kind of the direction they would go.
Yeah, though I have seen when it comes to real football, it seems like it's more energetic, it's different, more fan friendly, a lot more to the community as well, especially with all the sponsorships, both locally. That's not just small, but also big as well, which I'll discuss a little bit with another league here in a moment. And also, it seems like kids, the younger ages, are a little bit more enthusiastic with arena football compared to NFL games that I have noticed throughout the years because it's probably different. And with the faster motion, it's a lot more for them to keep focus on rather than the speed of the game of the NFL.
Correct. And that's, watching NFL for as long as I've watched NFL, and which has been, I'm showing my age here, which has been nearly 35 years at this point. I've watched a lot. I've watched more games than I care to admit. Now, I those bad years with the Rams, I wasn't hardly watching football from 09 to 10. I didn't really start watching football until they kind of hired Jeff Fisher in 2012. I felt like they're going to try now. They're going to make an effort at this point. Scott just messaged in on the comment section and said that being a live game, there's a lot of downtime. There is a lot of downtime. Yeah, and the thing that fascinates me, and I'm gonna dip into that a little bit. And the reason I'm going to dip into that a little bit is solely based off of the fact that with the downtime in the NFL, right? Mm-hmm. And the time you have as the plays develop and between plays, they always talk about baseball, right? I'm going to use an analogy. I'm going to kind of, use this for a minute to prove a point. They always said that baseball's so boring because it's so slow, right? And, I was always growing up and the elders that always watched it that, grew up with it in the 40s and 50s and things like that, grandparents, so on and so forth. They always say, well, it's a thinking man's game because that's the way you have to perceive it. You have to think through it. Well, and then obviously since the advent of bringing the DH over to the NL side, that's taken away that managerial aspect of it. It's really kind of taken a big hunk of that thinking process out. Well, the problem was they didn't really necessarily make the game any more exciting. I mean, it's baseball. I'm a baseball guy. I love baseball, as anybody knows. But the fact of the matter is that you can't compete with the 800-pound gorilla in the room that is the NFL. But that being said, talking fast pace, Scott just said it in the comment here again. I'm going to bring it back up again. There's a lot of downtime. Amen. There is. But when people try to compare it to other sports, they go, oh, well, I mean, baseball's like sap dripping off a tree. It's so slow. You can't even, that's why nobody wants to go to the games. Nobody wants to sit out in the grandstands, out in the bleachers. You're at Busch Stadium in St. Louis. You're in an afternoon game in the dead of summer. Let's say it's July or August. It's 105 degrees out there with about 85% humidity. Let me tell you something. It gets really hot out there in the outfield bleachers. I don't care who you are. It gets hot out there. And I mean, could you imagine being in another market, obviously like Arizona or something like that, playing in the summertime if they didn't have a dome? Could you imagine how hot that would be and how miserable that would be? But again, it's the speed aspect of the game. This is kind of the big core component of what we're talking about here, aren't we, Will?
Yeah, of course. And Also helps when it comes to arena football that everything's inside in air conditioning during the times here. Especially, I will say, it was actually pretty good for the UF to have a game here during this time for the Battlehawks in a dome because it was severely hot than usual here in May. So every time walking, no one is going to be saying to us, I think, yep, correct, Scott.
Yep.
So,
Yep. I like my air conditioning. The older I get, I remember whenever I was a young pup. I remember everybody's, oh, you're still young. I don't trust me. I get up in the morning. I don't feel that young anymore. The knees just aren't the same. Well, they're just not the same anymore. Everything creaks and pops and cracks. It's just one of those things. And so when it comes to the speed of the games,
mm-hmm.
and the differences between what I tell people with the AFL and the UFL and the NFL and even CFL in there. If you like fast-paced action, you like high scores, you like a lot of scoring, you need to be watching the AFL. That's where your focus needs to be. It doesn't need to be on the UFL or the NFL or any of that other stuff. Yes, you're going to get games like that. I remember that blowout with the Rams, and I think it was 2014 or whatever against the Raiders. They had an absolutely monster blowout, 2013, 2014, somewhere in that range. I'm sure someone will educate me on the time frame, but I remember that game against the Raiders, and it was a masterful blowout. It was a monster blowout, and the team was awfully bad. It was not really that good. The record did not that year indicate. Yeah, 52-0. Scott just said, I remember that game. I remember watching it on TV and thinking, oh my gosh, they've turned it around. They figured that, Cinderella found the glass slipper. I thought, holy smokes, we've got it now, boys. We're Super Bowl bound. No. Yeah, I remember in 95, whenever the Rams came over from LA, and we had that great start, went 4-0. We had Chris Miller at quarterback. We had Jerome Bettis at running back. We had a decent defense behind us, but we just really didn't have a whole lot of offensive weaponry outside of the bus at running back and Isaac Bruce at wide receiver. But Isaac Bruce was in year two. He was still a pup. Yeah, he put up a lot of yards that year, and he was the focal target, but you can't have that in the NFL. You got to have two number one receivers, and then you got to have a number two in your slot. Yeah. That's the way it has to work. Because if you don't have that other guy to go to, look at the Patriots when they had Randy Moss. Who else did they have to throw to, Will? I'll wait. Prove my point. Why didn't they win a Super Bowl with Randy Moss and Tom Brady? It's because they didn't have any other weapons. You could have defense all day long. Now, the exception to the rule would be what, the 85 Bears, and the 2000 Ravens. Well, the Buccaneers. I guess you could throw the Buccaneers in there. What was that? 02, 3?
Somewhere 02.
I think it was 03. It was after Dungy. It was after Dungy had left and went to Indianapolis, and Chucky was traded over there from the Raiders. Yeah. And he played the Raiders that year in the Super Bowl because Rich Gannon was still at quarterback, and I think Dennis Allen was the head coach over in Oakland at the time. In which
so when it came to the Buccaneers, it wasn't really more of the passing game. It was also the rushing game from now what seems to be rare for a fullback with Mike Allstott.
Oh, man. Ladies and gentlemen, I got to tell you something right now. If you have never seen Mike Allstott run, look him up. Get on YouTube. Bill Callahan. That's who it was. It was Bill Callahan that was the head coach over there in Raiders country and in OKLA. But yeah, that you got to watch Mike Allstott. Go to YouTube after the show. Remember, Mike Allstott, Buccaneers, and watch his highlight videos. I mean, he's a monster, absolute monster.
And that's one thing about with the Arena Football League. They're bringing back the fullback as the runner. That's the one thing. They're bringing the big guys. All sorts.
You know what I would love to see? I would love to see more of that. I would love to see that big, huge, massive running back putting his head down, having those great, big, huge shoulder pads. Okay, my men from the 80s, you remember a certain running back at St. Louis that wore the number 32. You remember those shoulder pads? You remember that? You remember how big they were? You remember the Nigerian Nightmare in Kansas City? Hmm? We go back even further in the 70s and even into the early 80s with like Earl Campbell and Tony Dorsett. Eddie George was kind of like that last bastion, right, of the big backs, of those big power backs. Steven Jackson was kind of a hybrid between the two because he's big, don't get me wrong. He could put his head down and he could run.
Probably the big passing running back to do that. And let's not also forget when it comes to the Chicago Bears, 85, once the fridge got the ball sometimes. And
the fridge. Yeah, in those special packages at goal line packages, whenever they would run that. Because again, I mean, who's going to bring it? He's going to fall forward and take 3 yards with him. I mean, that's just the way it is. But remember when we had Jeff Robinson in St. Louis in the late 90s, early 2000s, who was a converted defensive end or defensive tackle. I can't remember which he was. I think he was a defensive end. Jeff Robinson. He came over from the Broncos, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. See, there's some stuff floating around in here that makes sense and some stuff that doesn't. Some things I get confused. Sometimes I get dyslexic on names and everything gets twisted up.
Yeah.
But sometimes I have some smart moments, don't you think?
Yeah. And I also want to mention that first game I mentioned that was kind of like a bingo card to arena football. They actually, because in that one, the tackle tight end, that's another big tight end, big man touchdown. They had about one or two to that position. And right before we talk about the new Arena League here, I wanted to show a little bit something with St. Louis Arena football history here. My brother was able to find this at a lost and found at his job. If anyone remembered the X League, during that time, that was when we had the St. Louis Attack, and the owner owned the Attack and the Pennsylvania Steam there. And, of course, that was the last time the arena team here at St. Louis actually made it to a championship. They were so close and lost there. And then also, too, before the Attack, because for a lot of things in arena football with St. Louis, rebrand after rebrand after rebrand before the St. Louis Attack. And I want to thank someone for giving this to me here. This is a beanie of the Missouri Monsters. Right here.
That's a dandy right there.
And I believe this, I think he told me, forgive me, Kevin, I forgot your last name, that this has actually belonged to the mascot named Mo. So Missouri Monsters have kind of makes sense. From Missouri, have a mascot named Mo, short for Monsters. So that was big for the Arena Football League. I want to talk about, of course, is the new deal, because there's actually a team near you, Derek, near where you are, with the new Arena League called the Ozark Lunkers. Let me actually bring the logo up there for a moment.
Lunkers. What a name. I mean, who came up with that? Lunker.
I think it was either a fan thing or with the owner, because here's the thing. And it kind of brings back, because it's kind of similar to another Arena Football League logo called the Minnesota Fighting Pike, which I believe if there ever is another Minnesota Arena Football League team, because the myth is now inactive with the whole, oh dear Lord, don't get me started with the whole thing with Lee Hunt's wife owning that franchise. It's actually interesting because I was talking about sponsorships. You have a team called the Ozark Lunkers, and anyone knows, been to Lake of the Ozarks, known for fishing, all that stuff. Strangely, there is a Margaritaville in that area for some reason, but that's how they put it there.
Holding it up there for Jimmy Buffett.
Yeah, rest in peace. And one of their biggest sponsorships, and it makes sense, is the Bass Pro Shop in Springfield.
Yes, a big tourist attraction, especially with their new aquarium down there. If you haven't been, you definitely go down there and check that out. Take the family, take the kids. It's a really cool experience. It really is. I've been there a couple of times. Will, going back to that beanie, can you pull that beanie up again for a second? River City Monsters, or the Missouri Monsters, I'm sorry. So the Missouri Monsters. Now, you keep holding that up there because I'm going to bring something up here too, and I'm going to bring this side by side so that way everybody can get a good look. Does that look familiar? I mean, there's kind of some similarities there, don't you think?
Yeah, just like a different shade of purple.
Just
And
different. Well, that's faded out. It's just really faded out. It's really bad. If you
okay.
look at the back end, it's a lot darker on the
Dear
inside.
Lord, when was the last time Starter even made hats?
Oh gosh, Starter hasn't made any kind of equipment for the NFL for since the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. And this is a official NFL licensed product. It's got it right here. Team NFL. Actually, I have it upside down. Team NFL and Starter Classic. I was at the facility these were made. I saw the samples when they made them. I have the secondary black one that is basically the away, because this was like the home version, but the away version just has St. Louis Stallions across the front. So it's like this, but just black and across the front, where this is two-tone black and purple. You kind of get the gist, you get the idea, but some similarities there. I just thought that was kind of an interesting little anecdotal thing.
Yeah, and the thing about the Arena League that I kind of like, they only are getting into mid-market cities. Like, for example, Springfield, it's about what's the population there? Is it less or more?
Well, so I had moved there in the end of 2015, and I spent about 5 years in that market. At the time, whenever we moved there, it was about 150,000 people in the city core. By the time we left in 2020, and this was about the summer, this is June of 2020, whenever we left, they were up over 200,000 in the city core. And that does not count the surrounding suburban areas, and again, akin to Dallas, right? Where you have all of these surrounding areas like Arlington and Fort Worth and, Austin's not that far away. And you just kind of have this big circle that just kind of merges out from Dallas. And there's no clear delineation between the entities. It's like boom, on to the next. You just kind of transition. And that's a lot of how Springfield kind of has been at this point, and it's getting to that stage where the surrounding areas around the Springfield market, which at the time, whenever I was there, was the number 76 largest television market in the nation, which has now grown to somewhere into the 60s at this stage. And so they are sneaking up. They're an eerily sneaky kind of area because they are this hub city. And think about it, where Kansas City's at, kind of a hub city. St. Louis, kind of a hub city. Springfield, hub city, because there's nothing else outside of it. I mean, anybody that goes outside of St. Louis, either Illinois side, north side, south side. North side, you run into the plain, the just a flat fields and all of the kind of like Iowa cornfield type of stuff, right? As you go further north and, head up towards Iowa and up the northern part of Illinois. You go down further south, still kind of flat areas down towards Cape Girardeau, down towards the Boot Heel, things kind of flatten out. And then you go out west, if you're going out 70, if you're going out 44, 44 is more Ozarky, so more that kind of hills and hollers and a lot of trees and forests and things like that. But you could clearly run into that. It's like, boom, there it is. Pardon me. But you could clearly run into that at that point once you get out to about the Valley Park area. Once you get out past Fenton into the Valley Park interchange at 141, you start to see that clear delineation into those forested areas. So yeah, that's with Springfield. You better watch out. Because I remember in the 90s when St. Louis was like, oh, Nashville, you're cute. Oh, look at you. Look at you go. Way to go for you. You see him over here? And by the time they turned around and looked, Nashville was out ahead of them.
Yeah.
In the 60s, Dallas, same way. Dallas was not that big. I mean, everybody thinks Dallas has always been this huge. Dallas was not that big at the time. St. Louis really dwarfed a lot of these cities. There was a point in time where St. Louis was, the fourth, fifth largest city in the nation at one point in time. And I think around 60 to 70, it was consistently in the top 10. St. Louis as itself has hurt itself as far as a market. And you're starting to see these other markets like Kansas City and Springfield and other areas like that pick the bones, because that gaping hole that was left when St. Louis didn't come to bat, it didn't bring to bear its full weight of its, economic potential. People left and people went
Yeah,
other places.
and speaking of the other team that they have, and the league is actually headquartered in Kansas City. Interesting name here, the Kansas City Goats.
The Kansas City Goats.
Yeah, and then because, like I said, other mid markets, they had one here in the Waterloo, and I actually like this logo here. From Waterloo, Illinois, the Iowa Woo, kind of got like a Hawaiian shirt wolf there and cowboy hat and all that stuff. And it's kind of a fun type of little deal. And then the final one, and this is actually my favorite name, and in Duluth, Minnesota, the Duluth Harbor Monsters. Kind of got like a monster with the horns and stuff, kind of similar to a lot of what monsters looked like in both in the 80s and 90s cartoons back when we were kids, to be quite honest. And interesting enough that two of them, the Duluth one has a preseason game, and kind of funny, it's kind of go into AFL crossover. They're actually facing the Dallas Falcons, which was actually the first week one of the Philadelphia Soul in disguise, if you will, for the first preseason. And of course, they're going to play different because the Arena League, it's 6-on-6, not 7-on-7 as it, or 8-on-8 on Arena Football, sorry. And then Iowa, they're facing another minor league arena team facing their roots, the Minneapolis Warriors. And then the Arena League are going to be expanding by 2 next year into other 2 mid markets, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which is pardon me. Man, Derek, somehow
you're getting it's contagious, isn't it?
Yeah,
because I'm sitting here just talking away, yapping away, and then all of a sudden, like a piece of pollen or something, just write down your gob.
Yeah, and
so Scott asked a question here.
I don't have the
jersey. Well,
I don't have the jersey,
but
unfortunately.
Could we? That's the thing. So I was looking online, and there are some Missouri Monster jerseys, and there have been some Missouri Monster jerseys that have been for sale on a place called Worth Point. I think it's just something neat to kind of point out. So we're just going to go ahead and show that and bring it up just to kind of give you an idea.
Let me be clear. I had one.
You had one.
Yes, I had one. I need to. Yeah, so that's what it looks like.
Here you go. This is a really good example of the Missouri Monsters jersey. And here's your football, Will, right here, an Ultimate Indoor Football League game ball. Carver, Nelson, Dreyer. There's some, Northern Kentucky River Monsters UIFL jersey right there. So there's some cool jerseys, that they have.
Yeah, the only jersey I have because I'm wearing River City Raiders gear that came out in. That actually was a retain that came when the Rams left, and I actually do have an authentic jersey signed in my closet right now, which might show on the next show. Because Derek, we're actually about a little bit.
That's because he has one.
Yeah. Oh, you have one.
Yeah, we're coming up on a hard hour, and we've had a great time, and we're gonna have to wrap this up, boys and girls, because formatting fears no man.
So we'll probably discuss a little bit more with the Arena League next week, and we'll be here. I'll be here next week, and follow our next show here on the Field Sports of Texas Talking Football. See you next week.
See you, everybody. Stay tuned.